Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Comic Hunters, a game about collecting comic books, specifically Marvel comic books, throughout different eras, going to different locations through card drafting. Let me show you how it works at the table, then we'll come back here and I'll let you know what I think. All right, here you see the components for Comic Hunters and the kind of starting setup as if this were a four-player game. Just a couple of things is that there are some randomized elements that you would take care of at the beginning of the game. For example, you're going to be looking at which of the comics are going to have kind of the most demand. And so these are randomly chosen at the beginning of the game. And so up here at the top, you've got Spider-Man, you've got Black Widow and Iron Man in the second tier. And here in the lower tier, you've got Captain America, Black Panther, and Thor. And you could have also had Doctor Strange or Hulk randomly kind of come out there. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, these are just how they came out. And then there are also some symbols down here that are randomly selected at the beginning of the game. There are a couple that are printed on the board. You can keep those on there and just have a third random, or you could cover one of those up with a different one if you wanted to, just to kind of keep the variety throughout the game. This is going to be used primarily for set collection. In Comic Hunters, what you are doing is collecting Marvel comic books throughout the ages. And you're going to do this by going to a number of different locations and going through a particular type of drafting. And so looking at this area of the board, and I do need to point out, you may have noticed already that this is not in English. This is in Portuguese. This is a Brazilian publisher, and so all of this is in Portuguese, but the vast majority of the game is language independent. And so I'll give you what the kind of what these are in English, but generally speaking, throughout the game, you're going to be playing through 3 main rounds, and you're going to be doing, as I said, drafting. And so here, this is the store, and at the store, you're going to be, at the comic store, you're going to be getting the newest comics, all right? And so they would be coming from this number 1 deck, which are going to be 2000s, you know, the up to 2015 here, we got from 2007, and these are actual Marvel comic book covers. And so that's one of the really kind of special things about this game, is that you've got a whole bunch of actual Marvel comic covers that make up the cards in this game. So at the store, you're going to be getting the newest comics. Here at the flea market, you're going to be going from the number 2 deck, which is going to be from slightly earlier. Here you see 1999 Black Widow, a 98 Black Panther, 94 Spider-Man. And so at the flea market, you're going to be getting comics that are slightly older, all right? The next one is they show the convention here, but let's go to the auction website, which is C. The auction website is going to be getting the older comics. So here you see a 1972 Daredevil, which is actually classified as a Black Widow comic because Black Widow's in that comic. Here you've got a 1968 Thor. All right. So these are coming from different eras, going from newest to oldest. And then D here is the convention. So you're going to a comic book convention, and this is made up of comics from all 3 of the eras. At the beginning of the game, what you do is you take 10 cards from each of those 3 eras, you shuffle them all together to make the convention deck. And as I mentioned earlier, each one of these locations is going to be utilizing a different form of drafting. And so what I'm going to do is just briefly go through how all of these different drafting elements work, and then I'll talk about how you score and how you win. All right, let's go to the comic book store and get the newest comics. So what we're going to be doing here for this drafting phase is very simple. We're going to be handing out 4 cards to every player. They're going to have these 4 cards. They're going to choose one of these 4 cards that they want to keep. They're going to pass the remaining 3 cards to the player on their left. The player on their right is going to be giving them cards, and you're going to draft very simply, perhaps in a 7 Wonders or Sushi Go style, where you take 1 card and you pass them to your right until you end up with 4 cards. Very simple. The store is the simplest version of drafting in the game. All right, let's go to the flea market and get our slightly older comics to add to our collection. Here, this is going to be coming from the number 2 deck. And what you're going to do for this form of drafting is you are going to be taking cards from the top of the deck, and you're going to be creating a number of rows equal to the number of players, starting with 1 card face up. So in this 4-player game, we would take 4 cards from the top of the deck and start our 4 rows. All right. So here we go. We've got our 4 rows with 1 card in each row. Now, the first player, what they're going to do is they're going to have one of 2 options. They're either going to choose one of these rows and take all the cards in them. In this case, it would only be taking 1 card. Or they're going to take the top card from this deck and add it to any of those 4 rows that they want to. So let's say that this first player wanted more than 1 card. You'll never go to beyond 4. That's something to keep in mind, is that these rows will never go beyond 4. So they've got another Hulk card. Maybe they don't want to double up on Hulks and make that too attractive for somebody, so maybe they'll pop that in here. Then the next player is going to have their choice. Do they take any one of these rows, or do they add to it? So maybe they're going to add. They take another one. Man, we got Hulks aplenty, so maybe they'll put that down here with that Doctor Strange. Next player comes around, and so you keep going until either someone says, I like this row, I'm going to go ahead and take these 3. And then the next player would have the same option. They can take one of these 2, or they can continue to add. Now, if they're going to continue to add in this case, they can't add to that row that's already been taken. It's not like you'd start a new one. You're continuing to add to these until every player has chosen a group of cards in a row to add to their collection. That is the flea market. All right, we're actually going to skip the convention for the time being because I want to go to C here, which is the auction website. We'll come back to the convention in a moment. And this is going to be a different form of drafting that is actually going to incorporate an auction. So the way this is going to work is that, again, this is somewhat player count dependent, but we're setting this up as if it was a 4-player game. We'll take out of this number 3 deck, and we're going to set up a number of rows. The first row is going to have 5 cards. These are all face up. And then we're going to have 2 rows of 4. And then we're going to have a row of 3. This is denoted here on the board. So we've got our kind of market of cards that we're setting up here. And you're going to be doing an auction, as I mentioned a moment ago. That's mostly on camera. You can get the idea here. This last one has 3. The first player is going to choose one of these rows, and they're going to start an auction on it. The currency, so to speak, is the secret stash, and every player starts with 15. We'll just call it generic currency here. But these are also points at the end of the game. Whatever of these you don't spend are just straight points at the end of the game. And so let's say that the first player didn't want to go for this first juicy row that has all 5 cards. Maybe they go for one of these 4 rows, and they say, all right, I'm going to start an auction here, and I'm going to start this at 3. The next player, clockwise, is going to have a chance to outbid that. They can go up to 4. They can go beyond that. They can go all the way. Let's say they wanted to go all the way to 5. You know, they're feeling they want this pretty badly, and they're going to go up to 5. Then it's going to continue to go around clockwise until everyone either bows out or we have someone that has won it. Let's say that the yellow player has won this auction for 5. They would show that they have spent that much. They'd go down. If the first player was not the one to win this, then they would go and choose another row and start another auction on that until every player has chosen one of these rows. That is going to be, again, points that you are spending to buy these cards, so to speak, because whatever you don't spend are straight points at the end of the game. All right, now we're going to jump back to the convention. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this convention deck is made up of 10 cards from each of the different eras. At least that's how it starts. You'll kind of see how this gets added to throughout the game. But this starts off with 10 from each of the eras. All right? And so for the convention, what you're going to be doing, I'm going to move this all off camera here in a moment because I'm going to need a lot of space, is you are setting up a 5x5 grid face up of cards from this deck, and you're going to leave the center spot empty. So I'm going to cut off camera here for a moment, set this up, and we'll be right back. All right, so it's going to look set up something like this, where you've got the 5x5 grid with an empty spot in the center. What's going to happen is that every player is going to have a chance twice to select cards out of this array, and it's going to be done in a kind of a snake draft style, where the first player is going to get the first shot, It'll go clockwise around to the last player. That last player in turn order will get 2 turns in a row, and then it comes back in reverse turn order back to the first player. So the first player will get first and last shot. What you're doing here is you are choosing a row or a column. I did that backwards. A row or a column and a particular comic symbol. And you are going to collect all of the cards that have that symbol in the row or column. The one difference is that before you make your choice, you can pick one card and move it through any empty space. At the beginning of this round, there's really only one empty space, so you can move any one of these 4 cards if you wanted to. So let's say, for example, that the first player really wanted to get some Thor cards. Now, there's only, 3 Thor cards in this whole array is how it happens to be. And so let's say that this player says, okay, I'm going to move this Thor card down here because I can move it through empty space. And now I'm going to choose this row and call Thor, and I could take both of these cards because they both have the Thor symbol up there. Some cards have multiple symbols, like this card has a Captain America and a Black Panther. You would pick one of those. So now the second player has more options, more things to move around, a little bit more flexibility. Let's say, for example, they wanted to get some Black Widow. Maybe they would move this card here and up here, and they would call Black Widow, and they could take both of those. All right, and now you can see things are opening up. Now, you can never go outside of this 5x5 grid, so you couldn't take this Doctor Strange and move it around, things along those lines, but you could move this like this, and maybe call Black Panther and go like this. And as I said, every player is going to get 2 shots at their cards through this array, coming back to the first player. Okay, so I've shown you the 4 different ways that you're going to be collecting cards and getting them into your hand, but what are you doing with these cards? 3 times throughout the game, you're going to be organizing your collection, and this is where you're going to be setting up your collection that is going to be used for scoring. So there are a few different ways you're going to score points at the end of the game. You're going to be scoring points based upon the numbers of comics you have in these different tiers. Again, those were randomly set up. So for example here, all of your Spider-Man collections, which has to be at least 3. There have to be at least 3 in a collection for it to count for scoring. If you have between 3 and 4 Spider-Man comics, that's going to be 6 points. If you're between 5 to 7, you'll get 12, 8 to 11, 24, and 12 or more, 48. So that's worth the most in this particular game is Spider-Man. Again, those were randomly selected, and you can see how the tiers work down. So you're going to score points that way. You're also going to score points for the number of different collections you have of at least 3. If you have 3 different collections of at least 3, that's 5 points. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 goes down with those numbers of points. You're also going to score points for however many you have left over from the 2. You do this auction twice throughout the game. And so whatever you have left over is just straight points. So let's say that people had been kind of auctioning off different things. Wherever they're left is how many points they would get at the end of the game. And then you're also going to be kind of working towards majorities on these different symbols that are going to show up on your collection. So let me just show you how this works. During this organizing collection phase, what you're going to do is you're going to be taking the cards you have in hand, and you're either going to be starting new collections, or if you have already started collections, you're going to be adding to them. The first time that you start a collection, it has to start with at least 2 cards. Once you have a collection started, you can add any number of cards to it afterwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever you can afford. And I say afford because the way the cards work is that the era that they come from is the cost that it is to play them in front of you. So an Era 1 card is going to cost you 1 kind of virtual currency to be able to get it down in front of you as part of a collection. And so a couple of things you'll notice, this Doctor Strange is not really worth anything here because Doctor Strange just didn't happen to come up. It would count towards the variety of collections, and it also might count towards these because we'd look at the bottom. This has a number 1 symbol here. Well, again, this one didn't happen to have a spot down here. So we're not collecting the number 1 symbols. We're not collecting Doctor Strange. So why would you take this card? Perhaps you'd take it for currency to spend on other cards that you do want to put down. So let's say, for example, I want to get Spider-Mans out there because they're worth the most. I happen to have 2 Spider-Mans here, a 2 and a 1. If I wanted to put those down in front of me, I would have to spend 3 from another card that I have. So maybe what I want to do is spend this Hulk and this Doctor Strange, which is a 2 and a 1, because Hulk's not up there, Doctor Strange is not up there, Versus isn't in the mix, and neither is the number 1. So these cards are kind of worthless for me other than as currency. So I spend those, and now I've started my Spider-Man collection. Maybe I also want to get some of these Iron Mans out there. Well, I've got some expensive Iron Man cards. I've got 8 worth of Iron Man here. I only have 6 to spend, so I couldn't get all of these out. I could choose to put out a couple of these Captain Americas, but let's say I want to get out these 2 Iron Mans. All right, that's going to be 5. I could spend this 3 and this 2 and knock those out. And then I can hang on to a couple of cards between rounds. So I can hang on to these, and maybe I'll set up a Captain America collection later on, or maybe I'll use these as currency in future rounds. So you're placing out collections, again, starting with at least 2, but you have to have at least 3 to count towards these scoring totals. And you're going to go through this doing these different phases of drafting, organizing your collection 3 different times to do to get these variety of collections out there. And then you're going to have an end game scoring where you're going to count all of these different ways that your comics can score. Whoever has the most points at the end of the game is going to be the winner of Comic Hunters. Let's head back over and I'll let you know what I think about it. All right, so there you have Comic Hunters, collecting comic books with those iconic Marvel comic book covers, really a big kind of feature of the game. But there's a couple of things that I want to bring up before I actually get to the review. If you'll indulge me for a moment, this is a game that is exceedingly hard to get a hold of in many parts of the world. And that is primarily because this is coming from a Brazilian board game publisher. And so the game is one that I became exposed to because of a podcast that I do with Dan Hughes as part of the Dice Tower Network. And I saw someone on our Facebook group, on our podcast Facebook group, post a picture of this game. And I'd never heard of it. I was completely unfamiliar with it, but I was very taken by this idea of a game about collecting Marvel comic books that seemed to use actual Marvel comic book covers. And so this was somebody that was one of our listeners, and I reached out to him and said, hey, what is this game? I've never heard of it. And he lives in Brazil, and he kind of talked to me about the game and was very kind and offered to send a copy here to the Dice Tower Studios if we thought we'd be interested in it. Well, this library that we have here at the Dice Tower is one that we like to pride ourselves on. And when I say we, I mean primarily Tom. He's the cultivator and the curator of that library. And so he was very intrigued with the idea of getting a game that people might want to check out that's not readily available. So got a copy of the game. I have played it many, 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 many times. I have taught it many, 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 many times. But I do know that it's very difficult to get a hold of. But it still is one that I feel like is unique, and I wanted to talk about it in this review format. So again, I know it's hard to get a hold of, but it still is one that I feel like has a lot to offer, and let's get right to it. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is talk about benchmarks. These are some high-level ideas that I like to think about when I'm considering whether to get a game off the shelf or not. The first thing is setup and teardown. And in the case of Comic Hunters, there's a little bit of setup. It's primarily getting those cards kind of shuffled together to make your convention deck, getting the tokens, randomly shuffled and put out on those spots, but it doesn't take a tremendously long amount of time. So no issues there. The rules is another thing I like to talk about, and this one is a little bit unique in that the game originally did not have English rules. And so within the box itself, the rule book is in Portuguese. However, they have since uploaded a fully illustrated English rule book, and that has been uploaded to Board Game Geek. And so there's no problem there. Within those rules, I feel like they did a very good job of explaining the game, of using nicely illustrated examples. I feel like the rules do a very good job of teaching you the game. Didn't seem to be any ambiguities or problems with that. But just keep in mind that the original rules in the box are in Portuguese. You'd have to download a PDF version from Board Game Geek if you wanted to learn the game in English. The next thing I want to talk about is art and components. First, some things that did not work as well for me, and then the things that I enjoyed. The biggest issue that I have with this game in general is a component issue, and that is the highlight track, which was kind of that majority scoring depending upon those secondary icons on the cards. To track that throughout the game, you're moving along these little colored tokens in the player colors. And that's a bit fiddly. It's very easy to knock them down and bump them around. Now, it's not a huge issue because all of that is freely trackable information. It's right there in front of you. But it is a little bit annoying to deal with those fiddly little tokens. I do wish that they had come up with a different way of tracking that. But yeah, that's something to mention. That's probably the fiddliest part of the game. Also, the card quality is not the highest, and so this is a game that I feel like really should be sleeved. There's a lot of shuffling of the cards, constant shuffling of the cards, a lot of handling of the cards, and so this is a game that I would definitely recommend that you sleeve just to kind of keep up with repeated play. The cardboard components themselves are functional. They're perfectly functional, but they're not the most impressive. They're not like that super thick cardboard, but they're functional. They get the job done. Now, those are the things that didn't work for me, but one of the biggest positives of this game is just that incredible original Marvel art from the comic book covers. I mean, if you are a fan of comics, if you're a fan of Marvel comics and you walk by a table, and this has actually happened almost every time that I've been playing this game, if it's been in a convention setting, people will walk by and go, "Whoa, what is this?" Because they recognize so many of these comic covers, and they're like, "I had that comic when I was a kid." It is really remarkable to see all of these examples of the original Marvel art, comic book cover art out there on the table. If you are a fan of this, it's going to be really, really special. But even if you're not, it's still very cool to see all of these different artists' take on these different comic book characters. So it's one of the biggest features from this game is having access to all of this fantastic Marvel art throughout the different generations. So while there were some fiddly elements to some of the components, art is such a huge part of the positives to this game. All right, so for my overall game impressions, this is mostly all positive. I'm just going to throw that out there right at the beginning. So let me just go through all the things that I think worked very well. The one minor issue that I had with it, I'll leave to the end. This is a game that I think has one of the best marriages, if I can use that word, of theme and mechanisms. It's just a really cool idea of going through and collecting comic books. I mean, sure, you're drafting cards and you're doing them in different ways that may or may not be incredibly thematic, but the idea of collecting comic books and creating collections and basing them on different valuations is really, really thematic, and it's so easy to kind of tie that in while you're playing the game. You really feel like you are getting these collections and basing them on whatever the highest trend is right now. Maybe right now, Black Panther is a super popular character, and so those comics are going to be worth more, or maybe Black Widow, whatever the case may be, and that'll change game by game. It feels incredibly thematic to be kind of collecting these comics, putting them out in front of you and seeing this beautiful collection that you've created, either by going to auction websites or going to conventions or going to the comic book store or flea markets. It's just a really cool connection between theme and mechanisms. If you like Marvel, or if you just like comics in general, this game is going to be really right in your wheelhouse. I mean, you're going to probably be very impressed with just a game with this theme that is pulled off as well as it is. Oftentimes you see games that are based upon comic book characters and they're kind of cash grabs, right? They're kind of the cheap IP, little knockoff games where there's really not much put into it. This is not that. This is a game that is really kind of like a love letter to Marvel Comics, and if you are a fan of it, you're going to feel that love and you're going to be, kind of entrenched within it as well. But even if you don't love the theme, if you like card drafting, you're going to be thrilled because this is a game that's not only a card drafting game, but it handles it in 4 unique ways, which I think is so awesome. You've got the very standard kind of 7 Wonder style drafting. Many of us played games like that. But you've also got these other little unique twists on how to draft cards. You've got an auction mechanism in there as well. The convention where you've got the 5x5 grid with the open spaces. I've never seen anything exactly like that. You've got a spatial element as well where you can use that not only to help you set up for a really good collection of cards, but you can also block other players and make things harder for them to get to. So there's some really neat little twists on card drafting here that I think is also going to be attractive if you like card drafting, even if you don't like comics. The only negative thing that I will really bring up is that at the end of the game, that end game scoring can be a little bit cumbersome because you have to kind of go through all of those different phases. You have to say, oh, okay, how many collections do we have? What are our kind of rankings majority-wise on those secondary icons? So that takes a little bit of time to do the scoring, but that's a pretty small thing because overall, I think this game is outstanding. I'm going to be giving Comic Hunters a 9 out of 10, a strong seal of excellence. This is a game that I think is pretty special, and I really, really hope that it can become more available to people to play because, again, if you're a fan of comics, especially if you're a fan of Marvel Comics, you're going to be very interested probably in checking this game out just on that alone. But there's much more to it than that. There's a really solid drafting, set collection, auction card game that is pretty easy to teach and learn. It's relatively approachable, but it's very, very clever. Some neat twists on drafting. A game that I really, really love teaching. This is a game that I love exposing other people to because it's gone over very, very well every time. I can't say that I've had a single bad game of Comic Hunters, and that's pretty high praise. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.